you came up with these 6 categories, or maybe what I would refer to as archetypes, for
Mm.
founders: leader, accomplisher, operator, developer, fighter, and engineer. What kind of led you down the route of helping use the big 5 personality traits and their subcategories to create these archetypes, or link them at least to previous literature? And and how does one differ to the other, and why do these exist for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, okay, this is good. These are good questions. So the first point, I guess, by way of backstory for people not familiar with the personality literature,
Mm.
there might even be listeners who, like myself, not many that many years ago, are quite skeptical of this space. Um, so just a sort of a potted history of so over the last 20 years, there's been a kind of revolution in psychology, which is largely referred to as the positive psychology movement. So rather than the last 100 years of psychology prior to that, which was largely focused on people's difficulties and
Mm.
um, problems, mental problems they had. This sort
Abnormal
of new
psychology, right?
movements are
Mm.
exactly, yeah. So focusing on what are the strengths that people have and what are the individual differences that are not to do with neuroses. And part of that has created this big 5, which is 5 variables, different features, domains that you can characterize individual differences between people that are orthogonal to one another. So, in other words, they're independent of one another, and they're useful for measuring people's differences. And the important thing is that these are highly predictive of a lot of life outcomes. So there's all sorts of schemas for personality, and there's lots of different things. But Big 5 is the most robust and certainly the most accepted in contemporary psychology.
Mm.
There's an enormous amount of research which backs it and shows that it's reliable and repeatable, that people's personalities don't change largely throughout their lifetime, including during traumatic events. Once you mature and become an adult, there's kind of like this thing. We're also born with these things. It's really remarkable how young they sort of don't come fully formed, but tendencies to that kind of emerge and become personality through adolescence and so on. So it's really about who we are and how we like to engage with the world. I like to think about it in terms of it's kind of like an operating system where
Mm.
we're kind of born with an operating system, it seems. And it's just a preferred way of engaging with the world. There's no right or wrong to it, and increasingly the literature around introverts is recognizing that there's a lot of benefits to having sort of being an introvert versus being an extrovert. We sort of know what the benefits of being an extrovert are, but it's kind of um, but I guess increasingly there's evidence to show that being true to yourself, or at least understanding, the way that you like to engage with the world and are suited to engage with the world, because not everybody, myself included, are that self-aware of these traits. And I think that's where this idea of the alignment of what you do as for a career and your personality is really interesting, because if it was self-obvious, if it was, it was self-evident what our personalities are, then this wouldn't be a question. But I think for a lot of people, they're not even aware necessarily of these dimensions,
Mm.
that they have certain traits and his predispositions and so on. And so that's sort of where we started. And then um, moving on from the occupation work, I guess we were particularly interested in trying to understand, are founders like employees? And that was sort of the first question, like, are founders just basically a type of employee? And it turns out they're not. The first experiment we did, we looked at around 4,000 successful entrepreneurs from Crunchbase, which is the kind of definitive go-to data source,
Mm.
open
For
source
private markets.
originally, but now proprietary. But yeah,
Mm.
exactly, yeah, and they tracks global success of startup companies and their founders. There's about a million people, data on a million people in Crunchbase. Not all of them are founders, so there's venture capitalists in there. There's other advisors and so on. So we started with Crunchbase as a kind of sample. We sliced and diced that in various ways, and in this first study, we looked at 4,000 founders and co-founders of largely tech companies. So this study is largely around tech companies, but there's also other companies in there, tech-enabled companies, you might say.
Mm.
And then we created a contrafactual or a counter group, which was another 6,000 people who are unlikely to be founders. So we don't have a definitive set, but we created this entrepreneurial index, occupation index, using LinkedIn data. And we looked at 624 occupations, and we worked out how many what's the coincidence of founder and co-founder as a job title on LinkedIn with other occupations. And it turns out that some occupations have very low coincidence of those two job titles. So if you're a speaker or a CEO or a CTO, then it's quite likely that you might also be a founder or a co-founder. Founders and co-founders typically have exec roles within companies as well, and they often are associated with types of things like being a public speaker and so on. Whereas other roles, for example, like a cashier, for example, or many medical specialist roles, they're just not typically in the startup business. So by getting a sample of people who are unlikely to be founders and then a sample of founders, we also delved into our previous study and we got successful employees. The non-founders were employees who were successful in about 100 different occupations. So we've got these two different sets. We've got personality data we inferred for each of these. So there's about 10,000 people. The inference is using natural language processing and the tweets they use. So all these people, I should say, were on Twitter, and they have to have a certain amount of activity on Twitter before we can reliably predict their personalities. Once we do that, then we had two sets of large groups of people, founders and non-founders, and we found that on personality alone, we could distinguish the two groups using machine learning with about 80 to 90% accuracy. So it's quite clear that entrepreneurs are not like other people, or not like successful employees. There's kind of like they're a different type of